Hey everybody, it's me back to talk to you guys about the Foundation sequels and prequels. This will be a fairly short one because their content is actually intimately tied into the deeper meanings of the Foundation series, and that's what I want to talk about in the next video. I want to dedicate a whole video to that. I want to apologize for the state of my kitchen. Things have been a little hectic. We are preparing to go to Florida on a vacation with my in-laws. We have 4 kids, for those of you who don't know, 10 and under for all of them. And this is really like the biggest trip we will have ever undertaken. So things are a little hectic in the house, and I'm having to do things like this while everyone's gone because there's packing and preparing and extra homework, and it's crazy right now. So I'm backed up on my household chores and doing them while everyone's out of the house before I go to work. So sorry about this mess. It's gross, I know. I'm aware. So the Foundation. As I mentioned before, Asimov wrote the books. The first 3, it was a trilogy, very well received back in the 50s, and then in the 60s it started winning awards. Hugo Award, I believe 1961 or 62 for Best Science Fiction Series. Pretty big deal, right? So Foundation was popular, but then didn't do much with it. He did sort of a prequel, sort of a tie-in series, his Empire series, right? Where he was writing about the Galactic Empire, but there wasn't much in there that directly related to the Foundation at all. And then, in the early 80s, he started writing a series of sequels and prequels. Starting with I think it was 81 was when he started. And these became way more autobiographical. And not only did they expand on the whole idea of the Foundation, they also did something I think is very cool. They tied his Foundation series into almost every other popular sci-fi series he wrote. He tied it into his robot stories. He tied it into a couple standalone short stories. So he really made Foundation part of the larger universe, and he did it with 4 books. So there's 2 prequels and 2 sequels. The prequels dealt with Harry Seldon himself, and if you don't remember or you haven't watched the first video on me talking about the Foundation books, Harry Seldon is the guy who founded psychohistory, right? So we've got Prelude to Foundation and Forward to Foundation. Those are the 2 prequels. Prelude to Foundation deals with Harry Seldon going to a math conference, right? He's going to the math conference to discuss a paper he wrote about mass action, right? Mass action, for those of you who don't know, or if you haven't thought much about it, or if you just need a refresher, mass action is the idea that, like we discussed before, on a big enough scale, with enough sociological knowledge, you can predict human behavior over a long enough period of time, right? That's the mass action, the way that a mass of people act, right? Very simple. So he wrote about mass action, Harry Seldon did, and how theoretically you could come up with mathematical calculations that would predict the future, right? And it needs to be stressed that all of this at the time, theoretical. He just has the idea for this, right? He hasn't actually done it. So, the Emperor of the Galactic Empire, a fella named Cleon, gets wind of this paper, and he tracks down Harry Seldon. Basically says, hey, I am the Emperor, and as such, I have a vested interest in knowing the future and how to handle the events of the future. I think you should come work for me, Mr. Harry Seldon, and we'll make the galaxy a better place by you helping me run my empire. And Harry Seldon tries to tell him, I don't actually know how to do any of this. This is all theoretical. If you had read the paper and understood that, you would know I haven't worked out any calculations or anything. But the Emperor says, yeah, but you're still going to come do it, right? And Harry gets wind that the Emperor is going to have him do this one way or another, and that there's some dangerous people looking for him. So he runs, right? And he figures the best way to... I got this lid stuck on here. He figures that the best way for him to sort out all this psychohistory stuff is to track humanity back to the beginning, right? And so he goes to this system that's renowned for their historical archives, right? They have a rich history. He also encounters robots for the first time. That's important. That's Asimov tying this into his other works, because he wrote about robots a lot. He's famous for his robots probably more than anything else. But in the Foundation series, robots were noticeably absent, right? There were no robots in the original Foundation series. It's commented on a few times in these sequels and prequels. So he finds out that robots exist. He learns more about them. He finds out a few key players are robots that are trying to influence human events. And he sets up the Foundation on Trantor, which, as I told you before, is a little out-of-the-way planet, right? Saying it's a collective of artists and everything, but really, they're going to develop and curate society. And then, as the prequels continue, we get Harry Seldon as an older man, right before the Foundation books take place, putting his plan into action, finding psychic people. He called them mentalics, but it's psychic. We have more words for that now. So he's finding psychic people to found the second Foundation, right? They're the ones who develop psychohistory and guide human events. Like I said, autobiographical, so there's a lot of I don't know, for me at least, sad parts where basically everyone he knows and loves is dying because he's getting older. And then we move into the actual founding of the second Foundation. We've got the Foundation trilogy, takes place right after that. I'll take a little aside here. There were some books written in the 90s, some other prequels and sequels. In the 90s, the Asimov estate hired some science fiction authors to continue the stories. I am not going to get into those. Among fans of Foundation, those are actually pretty controversial as far as their canonicity. They were, as far as I know, they were written using some of Asimov's notes, his background info that he had written down, but they weren't written by him. And so, for the sake of, since it is controversial with some people, we're not going to cause any arguments here. It's pretty easy to leave them out without missing a lot, right? Those really just fill in some gaps. They don't add too much or take away anything. So they can be skipped. They're not bad reading if you get the chance, you want to take a look at them, go ahead. In fact, the whole thing, if you look at all of the prequels and the sequels, the Empire series, and the robot stories, everything that ties together eventually, you can construct a timeline of 15 to 20 books. And it's all pretty good reading. I don't know, there's not, I like Asimov though, so I'm a little biased. So into the sequels, right? The sequels, interestingly, also focus on the search for Earth, right? So there's a few neat ideas here. Number one, first thing they got to do, right, is find out what they would be looking for if they were looking for Earth. Now here's something that I really appreciated as a science fiction reader, because a lot of times, you know, all of the colonized planets, right? They all have a day-night cycle similar to Earth. They all have gravity similar to Earth. And so what the guys do is they take that into account. They say, hey, we have humans on all of these planets. Now it makes sense that humans would colonize planets that were like where they were from, right? Like the planet they evolved on. That they were basically designed by nature to survive on that world. So they take the temperature, climate, gravity, day-night cycle, they take all of that, they get a set of averages, and then they can start looking at the planets that fit those averages. And as they go further and further out, they start coming to earlier and earlier human settlements, right? They come to a few interesting ones. And this is one of the things that Asimov does really well. I've always said there are basically two types of Asimov stories, right? Asimov wrote sociological sci-fi, which means even if it's got a hard science fiction set to it, it's really talking about humanity, right? That's something I guess we're going to have to do a video on that another time to really talk about the difference here. But the sociological science fiction and scientific science fiction, right? So scientific science fiction would be stuff where, like, we're talking about the kinds of things we can do in the future, right? And we may talk about how that impacts humanity, but for the most part, the focus is on what the future can be and do, right? Whereas sociological science fiction focuses on where we as human beings are going to be in the future, right? So how does that technology impact us? How do we react to it? How do we develop it? And why? How do we shun certain things? So it's almost all sociological science fiction with him. But the two type of stories that he really excels at is the first, Asimov likes to write stories where he's basically got a philosophical question. He wants to use the story to answer it, right? That's basic science fiction stuff. Star Trek, pulp magazines, all of that. You come up with an idea like, you know, Black Mirror type thing. What if you found out your mom was a robot? And you explore from there. But the thing that Asimov does really well, and this was like iRobot and everything like that, is, and it sounds kind of a dickish way to put it, but basically what Asimov does really well is the hey, look how clever I am story, right? Where you don't even notice that he's discussing a philosophical point, or he's discussing something like I brought up before, something you have to take into account as a writer, right? And he's using the story to explain how he does that, right? And that's Asimov saying, I am a very clever person, and I can demonstrate that in the following way. And that's what these stories really are a lot of times. Is, for example, they go to one planet they think is a good candidate for Earth, the origin of humanity. And then the guy notices, he's all like, hey, there's no bees. He's like, what do you mean there's no bees? And he's like, not literally, there's no bees. What he's saying is, there's nothing like shitty in nature, right? And nature comes up with some awful stuff. But obviously this couldn't be natural because there's not enough awful stuff that nature would have come up with. There's all the good stuff, which is what humanity would have brought with them, but not like shitty things. Like, if humanity colonizes another planet, they're not gonna take with them packs of man-eating wolves, you know? That's just not part of the terraforming process. So that was him being clever. And eventually they get to Earth. I don't want to give you guys any spoilers because I've already heard from 2 people who have told me they're going to check the stories out, and it's a neat reveal once they do find the Earth. I'll tell you that they find it. They also find the homeworld of the Mule. You'll remember him from Second Foundation. So I won't spoil those, but those are really cool things, right? And I think Asimov, he really improved on an already almost perfect trilogy by adding those stories. Again, that's a controversial idea, that these stories were an improvement. There were some diehards back in the 80s, and I'm sure even still today, who think it was a mistake for him to even write those stories, but they're good. And so now you have a little background on the Foundation series, at least those 7 books in the series, not counting the supplemental ones by other authors, and the non-Foundation books that are tied in because of supporting details. So on Wednesday, I'll tell you guys my reviews and criticism, why I think the books are important, and talk about the impact that they've had on science fiction in general. So hope you guys have a great time. I'll see ya. Bye.